The first time Oren Nash regained consciousness aboard the Kirellian research vessel, he thought he'd been hit by a truck. His ribs screamed every time he breathed, his left leg throbbed with a deep, bone-level ache, and the room stank of sterile metal and something faintly citrusy. He blinked against the sharp white light overhead and tried to move, but a mechanical arm gently pressed his shoulder back down. Patient Oren Nash, remain still. You have suffered multiple injuries, said a calm, artificial voice. Yeah, Oren groaned. No kidding. A tall, translucent-skinned alien leaned over him. Its large, lidless eyes blinked sideways, and its long fingers manipulated a floating display that shimmered with unreadable glyphs. The human regains awareness, the alien said, its voice high and flat. You were recovered from the crash site on Meritha's surface. Ship fragments indicate atmospheric entry failure. My capsule? Oren asked, blinking hard. I was supposed to land on the platform. Your descent vector was compromised by a magnetic anomaly. You impacted terrain at high velocity. Fractures observed in 4 ribs, left femur, and lateral ulna. Internal bleeding controlled. Recovery underway. Great. So, who are you exactly? I am Yelrid, neurogeneticist of the Kirellian Collective. You are the first human encountered in a state of critical trauma. Your physiology is statistically unexpected. Oren squinted at him. Thanks, I guess. Where am I now? Research Base 7. Observation protocols are active. We are studying your cellular repair rate. You are adapting. Adapting? I'm just trying not to die. Yelrid stared at him for several long seconds, then turned away and tapped at the display. Oren closed his eyes again. The next 3 days blurred into a haze of scans, injections, and the low hum of alien machines. Each time Oren stirred, a different Kirellian hovered nearby, sometimes 2 or 3. They never wore clothes, just a light shimmer of bioluminescence along their arms and necks. When he asked for water, they brought it. When he asked for food, they delivered bland nutrient paste and translucent cubes. But mostly, they asked questions. What is the human pain threshold? How does your tissue regenerate with such efficiency? Why is your blood composition fluctuating with external stimuli? He answered most of them, though sometimes he was too tired to do more than mumble. The pain in his leg was worst, and they hadn't permitted him to stand yet. When he asked if it was broken, Yelrid confirmed with a scan. Femur fracture along the mid-diaphysis. Human bones regenerate with calcium and protein input. You are receiving both. So how long until I walk again? We estimated 90 days, Yelrid said. However, your osteoblast activity has increased substantially. You are adapting faster than our models predicted. Oren lifted his head slightly. You mean I'm healing faster than you thought? Yes. Statistically significant acceleration. We are recalibrating. Every day after that, more Kirellians showed up. They watched him breathe, monitored his sleep cycles, and took samples of everything from his blood to his tears. One even asked for a skin scraping, which he refused. I'm not a lab rat, he said. You are unique, Yelrid replied, and singular organisms warrant thorough scrutiny. Gradually, Oren was allowed to sit up, then to move his arms. When he managed to swing his legs off the table, a Kirellian technician panicked and slid him back up with a gravity puller. But after another week, the pain in his ribs faded to a dull throb, and the leg brace no longer felt welded to his body. They let him stand, carefully, with support. Yelrid watched. You are exceeding our expectations. Oren grunted as he leaned against a rail. Maybe your expectations were too low. We have studied over 1,000 species. None demonstrate adaptive response rates this rapid. You're saying I'm healing faster than 1,000 other species? Yes. Your DNA appears to rewrite protein synthesis pathways in response to environmental stress. This is not standard. Oren blinked. Rewriting itself? That doesn't sound normal. It is not. We observed similar sequences only in 2 extremophile species from the Findari belt. They are single-celled organisms. You are not. 2 days later, Oren was walking unassisted. Slowly, stiffly, but upright. The Kirellians followed him down the corridor as if he were some kind of miracle. He pressed his hand against the cool wall and took a deep breath. His lungs didn't hurt anymore. I need a shower, he muttered. Yelrid blinked. You are excreting through dermal pores. That is sufficient. No. I need hot water. Soap. Steam. It's a human thing. The Kirellians didn't understand, but they gave him a room with a water vapor chamber. It wasn't perfect, But it was enough. When he emerged, skin pink and clean, a small crowd had gathered outside. "You all need a hobby," he said. "We have one," Yelred answered. "It is you." Oren sighed and rubbed his temples. Soon after, they gave him a light mobility suit and permission to walk the inner deck. He started doing laps. The first round took 15 minutes. By the end of the week, he was down to 4. The pain in his leg was almost gone. "You are regenerating at 3 times the projected rate," Yelred said, watching his pace. "You said 90 days. It's been 20. This is not sustainable. Your body should be overwhelmed." "I've had worse," Oren said. Yelred stared at him. "Then humanity is more dangerous than we thought." Oren stopped walking. "Dangerous. Unpredictable. Fast adaptation leads to instability. Instability leads to threat vectors. We're not a threat. We're survivors." Yelred tilted his head. "You do not understand. Rapid adaptation is rare. It means your species can endure environments that should kill you. It means your kind might outlast us." Oren wiped sweat from his forehead. "We don't want to outlast anyone. We just want to live. Sometimes, that is enough to become dangerous." That night, Oren couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about what Yelred said. Were humans really that different? He'd never thought about it. Back home, people got hurt. They healed. They moved on. It was just life. But here, it was a phenomenon. The next morning, alarms blared across the ship. The lights dimmed to red, and the deck trembled under his feet. Oren stumbled into the corridor, where a Kirellian technician shouted something in their native language before sprinting past. Yelred found him a minute later. "Emergency. Containment breach in the arboreal lab." Oren frowned. "What kind of breach?" "A parasitic organism has escaped. It is predatory and hostile. We are evacuating the lower decks." "Do you need help?" Yelred blinked. "You are still healing. I can move. I'm not useless." Yelred hesitated, then handed him a containment baton. "If it attacks, strike the thorax." Oren followed him down the corridor. Smoke curled from a broken panel ahead. A Kirellian lay on the floor, unmoving, a gash across its neck. Oren swallowed hard and gripped the baton. The thing that burst from the ceiling wasn't like anything he'd seen before. It had too many legs, too many eyes, and a mouth like a spiral of bone and teeth. It hissed and lunged. Oren ducked, rolled, came up behind it, and slammed the baton into its back. The thing shrieked and flailed. He hit it again, harder. It collapsed, twitching. Yelred approached, scanning it with a handheld device. You ended its motor function. That was efficient. Oren leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "I don't like killing things," he said, "but I like dying even less." Yelred looked at him, then nodded once. "You adapted to combat faster than expected." Oren didn't answer. He didn't feel proud of it. His ribs ached again, and his leg throbbed, but he stayed on his feet. Later, in the infirmary, the Kirellians ran another full scan. His injuries were stable, but not fully healed. They administered pain regulators and left him to rest. Yelred stayed behind. "Your DNA is changing," he said. "What does that mean?" "You are not the same as when you arrived. Your genome has altered its own repair mechanisms. It is evolving in real time." "That's not possible," Oren said. "Is it?" Yelred stared at the screen. "For humans, it appears to be." Oren closed his eyes. And for the first time, he wondered if that was something to be proud of or something to fear. The next morning, Oren awoke to a vibration in the floor. Not the low, steady hum of the vessel's propulsion system. This was sharper, irregular, like someone was dragging something heavy down a metal corridor. He sat up too fast, his thigh muscle tensed like wire. He grabbed the edge of the bunk to steady himself, jaw clenched. A Kirellian technician swept past the open threshold, carrying what looked like a containment cylinder half the size of a person. It pulsed faintly with a reddish glow. Oren stood, pulled on the fitted overlayer of his mobility suit, and stepped into the corridor. "Hey," he called after the technician. "What is that?" The technician didn't answer, but Yelred emerged from a side hatch, holding a narrow, crystalline tool in both hands. "You are not restricted to quarters anymore," Yelred said. That was a containment vessel. It held sample residue from the arboreal breach. "Sample residue?" Oren frowned. "You mean parts of that thing I fought?" "That organism leaves behind metabolic filaments. They're still responsive. We are testing their reaction to environmental variables. Shouldn't you lock that down somewhere safer?" Yelred's pupils constricted slightly. "We are conducting resilience studies. Your presence is relevant." Oren folded his arms. You think I'm resilient like the parasite? Not identically, but similarly. You both exhibit adaptive acceleration under stress. We are observing patterns. Patterns of what? Evolution? Possibility. There was a long pause. Oren's gaze followed the trail of faint residue the technician had missed. Tiny flecks the size of ash flakes shimmered, then vanished. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Where's your quarantine zone? Lower research bay. Sealed environment. Would you like to observe? I'd rather see the outside of this ship. The exterior is not pressurized for human exposure. I don't need to go outside. I just want to see where we are. Yelrid hesitated, then gestured for him to follow. They passed through 2 security partitions and entered an observation chamber with a domed viewport. Beyond the curved glass, Muratha's atmosphere licked the ship in slow, glowing pulses. The planet spun beneath them in greens and slate blues, the rings casting a faint halo over the horizon. Oren stepped closer, his breath catching. You stayed in orbit? We never left. Your species requested no extraction for crash personnel unless confirmed non-viable. You were presumed unrecoverable. I wasn't. Yelrid tilted his head. Clearly. Several hours later, Oren sat in a diagnostic chair while a Kirellian medical specialist, smaller than Yelrid and with a pale orange hue to its skin, examined the latest readings. You are exhibiting lymphocyte density inconsistent with baseline records, the specialist said. Is that bad? Unclear. Try me. Your immune response is behaving as if you are under continuous microbial threat. Yet, no pathogens are present. Your body is simulating defense in absence of cause. Could it be the residue from the breach? There is no direct contact recorded. It may be a secondary trigger. Psychological exposure can manifest physiologically in humans. Yes. Yeah, it's called stress. That is being considered. The specialist rotated the chair and initiated a narrow beam scan across Oren's spine. The heat prickled through his skin. We have also detected marrow restructuring in femoral and humeral sites. My bones are changing again? Mineral density is increasing. Your body is reinforcing itself, as if anticipating future trauma. Oren exhaled slowly. That doesn't just happen without a reason. Correct. We are searching for one. By late cycle, he returned to the central corridor, where a section of the ship had been converted into a simulation chamber. A row of curved panels displayed terrain reconstructions, arid wastelands, dense forests, deep ocean trenches. Kirellians stood at various consoles, analyzing survival patterns of assorted species. Oren approached one of the panels. It showed a silhouette of a human figure walking through a volcanic wasteland, temperature gauges spiking. Is that supposed to be me? Yelrid appeared beside him. It is an extrapolation. Based on your current trajectory, you could function in environments far beyond Earth normal within 1 month. I'm not a superhero. I'm a guy who fell out of the sky and didn't die. That is precisely what makes you improbable. A sudden chime echoed through the chamber, followed by a shift in ambient lighting. One of the consoles flashed yellow. Kirellians converged on it. What now? Oren asked. Unscheduled reaction in the containment chamber, Yelrid said. They moved quickly. Oren followed without asking. Inside the containment wing, a thin crack had formed along one of the vessel's inner walls. Faint pulses of red light bled from it. The technicians were already sealing the breach with a layer of molecular foam, but the atmosphere in the room felt tight. Was that from the sample? Oren asked. Affirmative, a technician replied. The filament mass restructured under electromagnetic exposure. It attempted to escape. They're learning, Oren said. They're adapting, Yelrid corrected. Like you. That's not comforting. One of the Kirellians turned to him. You have already demonstrated suppression capability. You may become essential if another breach occurs. I'm not your weapon. No, Yelrid said. You were proof. The next 3 days passed under heightened security protocol. Oren was restricted from certain decks, but allowed increased access to observation areas. He used the time to explore the vessel's artificial biosphere greenhouse dome with Earth-simulated gravity and vegetation cultivated from human seed stock. He found a bench near an olive tree and sat down. The leaves rustled with artificial wind. It was the first time he'd felt the illusion of home. A Kirellian arrived, one he hadn't seen before. This one wore a neural relay band and carried a small device shaped like a flattened sphere. I am Talik, it said. I specialize in cognitive mimicry analysis. Cognitive what? We study brain pattern convergence. You and the parasite encountered similar stimuli, yet responded differently. We aim to understand why. Because I have a brain and it has a mouthful of knives. Talek blinked slowly. That is one interpretation. The device in its hand projected a rotating model of Oren's brain. Regions lit in sequence. We have observed increased synaptic traffic in your prefrontal cortex and cerebellum. You are processing faster than baseline norms. Maybe I'm just stressed. You are exhibiting neural plasticity consistent with training. Yet, you have not trained. Your brain is preparing for unknown variables. Are you saying I'm evolving on purpose? Not consciously. But your biology is making choices. That's terrifying. It is fascinating. Later that evening, the lights dimmed across the deck. Oren lay awake in his berth, fingers laced behind his head, staring at the ceiling. He remembered the moment the parasite lunged, the instinctive roll, the strike. It hadn't been planned. He hadn't thought he'd reacted. His body had known what to do before his brain had caught up. He sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the berth, and stared at the floor. Something in his reflection in the polished metal seemed different. Not wrong. Just altered. The door opened. Yelred stood there, expression unreadable. There has been another breach. Oren stood. Where? Mid-deck. One of the samples split in transit. Oren followed him into the corridor at a jog. As they reached the staging area, the lights flickered. A technician stumbled out of a chamber, bleeding from a deep cut across its side. Another Kirellian fired a containment pulse, but the creature behind the glass wasn't the same as before. It was smaller, faster. Its limbs bent differently. It had changed. It adapted to your prior attack, Yelred said. Oren grabbed the baton from the weapons rack, adjusted the frequency, and stepped into the chamber. The creature hissed and lunged. This time, Oren didn't roll. He let it come close, then ducked under its strike and slammed the baton into its lower joint. It shrieked and retreated, but he was already moving, jabbing again, until it convulsed and dropped. He stood over it, chest heaving. A moment later, Yelred entered. You anticipated its movement. I guessed. You were correct. Or lucky. Yelred bent down, scanned the remains. It is dead. You are unharmed. Oren looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking. That's not normal, he said. No, Yelred replied. It is human. By the fourth week, most of the crew had stopped pretending Oren was just a patient. He'd been cleared for unrestricted movement, given a translator implant that let him understand the full range of Kirellian vocal patterns, and assigned his own access credentials. That last one came after he rewired the sleep cycler in his room because the pulses were giving him headaches. You shouldn't have been able to override the security lockout, Yelred had said. I didn't, Oren replied. I bypassed it. The next day, they offered him a terminal and a workspace in the diagnostics lab. Not as a gesture of goodwill, as a test. By the second hour, Oren had restructured the emergency triage subroutine to reduce response latency by half. He didn't mention that he'd only done it because the lag irritated him. That had led to more questions. Not about his healing anymore. Not about his physiology. They'd wrung everything they could from his tissue samples and marrow scans. Now, they wanted to know about his cognition. Why he could solve puzzles without formal training. How he could intuit the function of alien software with one look at the interface. He didn't have answers. He just knew how to fix things that didn't work. At midday, Talek brought him a memory lattice cube and set it on the table. This contains a simulation of an extinct Kirellian outpost. We want to see how you navigate it. Why? To measure your extrapolative reasoning. It's a reconstruction of a facility no longer in use. The systems are hostile to organic entry. You want me to walk into your haunted house and not get fried. Correct. The cube lit up when he touched it. The room dissolved, replaced by a dim metal corridor bathed in blue light. A faint whir echoed around him. Simulation active, Talek's voice said from somewhere outside the construct. He walked forward, ducked under a low pipe, and stopped at a panel sparking intermittently. The console's language matrix didn't match anything he'd seen before, but he recognized the layout, a power routing hub. He traced the conduit backward, found a bypass node, and rerouted the feed. The lights stabilized. Doors open ahead. He moved quickly, ignoring the scent of ozone and the flicker of movement in the shadows. A false threat sensor triggered a noise burst to his left, a decoy. He ducked it and kept going. By the time he reached the core chamber, the simulation was already dissolving. "End sequence," Talik announced. Oren blinked as the lab returned around him. "You completed it in 1/3 the time of our fastest simulation subject. I guessed most of it. Your guesses are statistically anomalous." He shrugged. "Maybe I'm lucky." Luck does not rewrite code while under stress. Later that cycle, they brought him to a sealed observation deck where 3 Kirellians stood around a containment chamber. Inside, something moved not violently, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was a new organism, smaller than the parasite from the breach, but similar in structure. It had eyeless ridges along its body and a flexible jaw that opened like a trapdoor. "It was born in containment," said the one nearest to him, a broad-shouldered Kirellian with silver-lace skin. "It has no parent organism. It built itself using fragmented DNA." Oren narrowed his eyes. "That's not possible. It reconstructed from residue. It selected only the most efficient genes. It is a refinement of the first. Why show me this?" "Because it mimicked one of your metabolic markers." He took a step back. "You're saying it copied me?" "Partially. It incorporated a fragment of your healing profile. It is now able to regenerate minor damage." "How?" "When you destroyed the previous specimen, your blood contacted a fragment. It preserved the protein signature." Oren exhaled through his nose. "You didn't think that was worth mentioning earlier?" "It was only recently confirmed." The organism inside the chamber turned toward them. It couldn't see, but somehow it knew. "It doesn't look hostile," Oren said. "It isn't. It has no aggression markers, but it is learning." They let him observe it for the next day and a half. It never attacked the glass, never hissed or bared its teeth. It watched. When Oren moved, it mirrored his steps. When he lifted his hand, it pulsed faintly with red light. The Kirellians recorded everything. On the second evening, Yelrid joined him by the glass. "What's the plan?" Oren asked without turning. "We are debating termination. It hasn't done anything wrong. It has no context for wrong or right. It is not a moral entity. It's alive. So are viruses." He didn't reply. That night, he couldn't sleep. He ran diagnostics on the environmental system, recalibrated his translator implant, even tried reading Kirellian syntax charts. Nothing helped. At 5th cycle, he got up and returned to the observation deck. The chamber was dark. The organism floated in its stasis field, dormant. Oren stood there for a long time. Then it blinked. Not with eyes it had none, but the lights along its body pulsed in a pattern identical to the one the translator used to indicate comprehension. When he stepped closer, it rotated in place. He held up his hand. It did the same. He leaned close to the glass. "You're not supposed to exist." It flared once, then dimmed. He stayed there until the next cycle began. By morning, the Council of Senior Kirellians had convened. Not because of the organism, but because of him. In the hall outside the tribunal chamber, Talik approached with a data scroll. "They're debating your return to Earth." "I didn't ask to leave." "They are not sure you should." He frowned. "Why?" "You are changing. Not visibly. But internally, your systems are no longer matching terrestrial human norms. Your body is adapting to containment exposure, foreign stimuli, and synthetic compounds. I feel fine. Your equilibrium markers say otherwise. You no longer enter standard REM states. Your adrenal cycles have doubled. Your thermal regulation is no longer purely autonomic. Your skin adjusts in anticipation of temperature shifts. That doesn't make me dangerous. No, it makes you alien." Inside the chamber, the conversation was clinical. Each Kirellian spoke without emotion, citing data points, projections, and risk factors. Genetic drift, cognitive acceleration, environmental incompatibility. They weren't deciding whether to send him home. They were deciding whether he was still human. Yelrid stood at the center and said nothing. When pressed, he simply played a recording, a short clip of Oren in the simulation, rerouting the system under pressure. Then another of him fighting the breach creature, then standing before the containment chamber, mirroring its movements. The silence afterward stretched long. Then the eldest among them, a Kirellian whose skin had faded to near transparency, spoke once. "He is not one of us. But he may be one of what comes next." The tribunal ended. No decision was announced. They simply disbanded. Later that day, Oren stood in the biosphere, hands in his pockets, watching the olive tree sway under the artificial breeze. Yelrid joined him. "They've ended the study." "What does that mean?" They will not interfere with your return. Because I'm harmless? Because you are unknown. And unknowns are not to be contained. Oren nodded. What about the new organism? It has been terminated. He turned sharply. Why? It began mimicking neural patterns. It was not safe. You didn't give it a chance. It would not have stopped. He looked away, jaw tight. We are not so unlike, Yelrid said. You adapt. You learn. You change. But you are still you. Am I? Yelrid tilted his head. That is for you to decide. By the end of the day, a long-range transport pod was prepped. The Kirellians furnished it with supplies, a re-entry vector, and a message capsule to deliver to Earth authorities. Before boarding, Oren turned to Yelrid. You studied me like a phenomenon. What did you learn? That humanity is not defined by limits. You redefined your own boundaries with each crisis. He paused, then added, that is both wondrous and terrifying. Oren stepped into the pod. Yeah, he said. It is. The hatch sealed behind him. Re-entry began.